She's a Marxist. Everybody knows she's a Marxist. Her father's a Marxist professor in economics, and he taught her well.
As Kamala Harris's presidential campaign kicks into high gear, much attention has been placed on her background. One of the focal points has been Harris's father, Donald J. Harris. It seems that, depending on who you ask, Donald Harris is an economist of one or the other heterodox flavors. On Wikipedia, he is described as a post-Keynesian, while elsewhere people have referred to him as a Marxist. None of these characterizations are wrong. Harris is a well-respected economist who has dedicated his career to critiquing mainstream economics and developing various strands of heterodox literature. What has generally lacked in the discourse surrounding Harris's career has been the actual content of his contributions. To that end, we will be taking some time in this video to go over a selection of Harris's published works. Before we do so, some important framing comments are needed. This video is not a comprehensive overview of Donald Harris's work. On the contrary, there is an obvious and transparent bias in the focus here. We are primarily interested in Harris's engagements with Marxism. This video is also not intended to be a commentary one way or another on Kamala Harris or her campaign. By discussing Donald Harris's work, we make no statements, supportive or otherwise, regarding the Harris-Walz presidential ticket. Ultimately, there is clearly little connection between Donald Harris's career and that of his daughter. More than anything, today's video is using the heightened attention to and press coverage of Kamala Harris's background to motivate an exploration of Donald Harris's work. With those points of clarification in mind, let's dive into some of Donald Harris's theoretical perspectives. One of Marx's more controversial propositions is that the functioning of the capitalist economy inescapably drives the general rate of profit down over a long time horizon. This prediction has been developed extensively both from theoretical and empirical perspectives. For a thorough coverage of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, see the video on our channel focusing on this topic. In brief, Marx predicted that competition among capitalists strongly pressured each of them to adopt technologies that replaced labor with capital. That is to say, technologies that increased the ratio of capital inputs relative to labor inputs. A capitalist that successfully implemented such a technology could undercut the competition and secure brief windfall profits, until the rest of the industry caught up with the new technique. Importantly, for Marx, new value could only be added by labor. Thus, by reducing the amount of labor used in production, the new technique reduced the new value created. The rate of profit being the ratio of new value created and the total value of capital and labor employed in production, the gradual shrinking of value added meant that the rate of profit would continually decline. Marx, of course, noted that there are many ways in which this dynamic pattern of labor cost saving could be counteracted, resulting in a constant or even increasing rate of profit. More details on those counterforces can be found in the Tendency of the Rate of Profit to Fall video. Since Marx, scholars have either argued for or against the existence of such a tendency. These arguments have been brought to the data, with some results indicating a clear fall in the overall profit rate, while others continuing to challenge the hypothesis. In the simplest terms, Harris argues that there is no a priori tendency in the increase or decrease of the rate of profit. Instead, these patterns are strongly dependent on context. Harris reminds us that there are different ways to think about the capital-labor ratio. There is the technical composition of capital, which looks only at the ratio of physical capital inputs and physical labor inputs. The value composition, however, looks at the labor value of capital over the labor value of labor power. He then shows us that labor-saving technological change can increase the machine use for every unit of output, but also decrease the labor value of that output. A lot ultimately rests on how the technological change has affected the overall economy. If the change reduces the value of the goods produced, then the value composition of capital does not necessarily increase. It's true that more capital is used to produce the output, but that capital's value may be unchanged or even decreased. Thus, the physical quantity of machines has grown, but the value of those machines may have decreased, such that the value composition of capital has remained the same. What does this mean for the rate of profit? The value of output has gotten smaller, but so has the value of the inputs needed to produce things. So, it is possible that the rate of profit has not changed at all. It may even be possible, under the right circumstances, for the rate of profit to increase. The main point Harris wants to make is that there is no guarantee that the competition-driven automation of production will change the composition of capital in value terms, and therefore exert a downward pressure on the rate of profit. It all depends on the kind of technical change occurring, in which sectors it occurs, and how important the sectors are to the rest of the economy. Harris stresses that the structure of a capitalist economy is such that society develops unevenly, which further complicates the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Adoption of a specific automation technique in one sector does not have a single determined effect on the overall profit rate. Another focus for Harris has been critiquing and developing theories of economic growth. For Harris, neoclassical, also known as mainstream growth models, have failed to explain how an economy expands over time. The older models, including the ones still taught in many undergraduate classrooms today, explain growth through outside factors such as an increase in the population or a change in technology. Essentially, growth occurs because something from outside the system shocks it positively. Harris aptly states that such exogenous growth models have no theory of growth at all. Moreover, the neoclassical framework has no conception of classes, focusing instead on individual households that supposedly make consumption decisions across a defined lifespan. Harris characterizes the neoclassical models as only seeking to answer the question of efficient allocation of resources in accordance with consumer preferences. Instead, Harris believes that a theory of growth should explain the expanded reproduction of the capitalist mode of production on a world scale. Harris then sketches a model based on Marx and Koletsky, where growth depends on the rate of exploitation, expected profit rates, and capitalist savings. Unlike the neoclassical model, Harris's model directly incorporates social mechanisms, namely class struggle and the balance between labor and capital. Moreover, the theory of growth is grounded in behaviors and interactions of distinct classes, as well as different technologies available to a given economy. In a different paper, Harris explores the unevenness with which capitalism tends to develop. Looking back to Marx, Harris models an economy with two sectors, one that produces the means of production, aka capital goods, and one that produces consumer goods. The question Harris is most interested in is what conditions must be met for both sectors to grow at the same pace. This type of growth is known as balanced growth, and is generally preferable for an economy as it ensures sustainable expansion. By contrast, if one sector outproduces the other, the economy risks entering a crisis where some of the produced surplus cannot be consumed. Harris demonstrates that balanced growth in capitalism necessarily requires redistribution of surplus value such that some capitalists gain at the expense of others. This relates somewhat to the scenario of unequal exchange, which is covered in a different video on this channel. The gist is that competitive forces equalize prices and rates of profit, while the actual values of produced goods are not necessarily equal between the producers and sectors. The result is that some capitalists sell their output at a below-value price, while others sell their output at an above-value price. This phenomenon can be thought of as the price mechanism redistributing value, in this case from one sector to another. In short, the Marxist model of capital accumulation predicts that balanced growth is possible, but only through the redistribution of surplus via the competitive price mechanism. Using the concept of value allows us to see that some portion of the social surplus is captured by a group of capitalists at the expense of others. Finally, let's look through some of Harris's views on the connection between racism and capitalism in the United States. An integral concept in this discussion for Harris is the notion of exploitation. Harris is careful to define exploitation specifically in Marxist terms, as he views the alternative understanding to be unsystematic and inadequately applicable. Whereas Marx's predecessors correctly identified exploitation as the process by which some of the social surplus created by one class of people was appropriated by a different class of people, they struggled to systematize their thinking. The marginalists, who came after Marx, simply disregarded exploitation altogether, except in the unique instance of a deviation from a theoretical equilibrium. Harris strongly prefers Marx's understanding of exploitation because it is well developed and does not limit itself to fringe cases, as does the mainstream marginalist perspective. In fairly simple terms, exploitation describes the appropriation by capitalists of an excess amount of value which is embodied in the product of labor. In other words, because of their exclusive ownership of the means of production, capitalists get to keep the difference between the value produced and the value of the labor power paid out to workers in the form of wages. In his discussion of exploitation, Harris explicitly notes that the division of any working day into paid labor time and unpaid labor time is metaphorical. Harris stresses that only workers as a class can be thought of as producing a social surplus. In other words, dealing with all of these categories, the rate of exploitation, surplus labor time, surplus value, and so on, requires thinking in the aggregate, that is to say, at the social level. Because all the forces at play are systemic, it is best to treat the behavior of individuals as largely independent of their individual will and intention. As social beings, both workers and capitalists perform actions in correspondence with their class position in society. Workers will feel the drive to demand higher wages. Capitalists will feel the drive to put downward pressure on wages and other costs. This actually carries an important insight in the analysis of racism and capitalism. The implication is that capitalism carries with it certain intrinsic, impersonal mechanisms that can make use of and perpetuate racial discrimination. Harris goes on to ask whether black labor is more exploited than other labors. This question is left unanswered because, according to Harris, speaking of specific rates of exploitation is as misleading as splitting up an individual's working day into paid and unpaid labor. There is not a good way to measure the rate of exploitation, since it is meant to be understood on a much broader social level. But it is worth, in Harris's opinion, to ask how the concrete conditions of exploitation might differ between black and white labor. This is something that can be discussed and understood because we can observe black labor being situated in different locations in the production system, consuming different use values, possessing different strengths of organization and militancy, and experiencing overall different historical conditions of development. Moving towards black history in the United States, Harris explains that slavery was, in fact, a kind of primitive accumulation for the black population, in that it forcefully separated black communities from any ownership of the means of production. Thus, slavery was the contextual condition from which black labor emerged in American capitalism. This has, of course, structured the ways in which black labor fits into the U.S. economy. The division of labor in the U.S. has historically taken on a racial or ethnic character. Black labor, for instance, has generally been relegated to the low-wage sectors, usually requiring the execution of strenuous activities or working in more hazardous environments. What appears to be most important for Harris in this discussion is the role of black labor in the so-called reserve army of the unemployed. Recalling the earlier ideas on capital accumulation, the competition that characterizes capitalist economies necessitates a type of innovation process that continually throws workers out of employment. Indeed, the system as a whole relies heavily on this regulation of the employment level, such that the existence of a pool of unemployed people is integral to capitalist growth and stability. This reserve army of laborers, ready to take a job at much lower wage rates than their employed counterparts, also helps control the growth of wages. Racist institutions in American history have, in turn, ensured that the black working class has disproportionately restocked the reserve army. Harris frequently asserts that capitalism is a system that develops unevenly. Rather than being a deviation from some ideal form, this quality of capitalism has always been one of its defining features. Capitalism relies on unevenness to extract additional surpluses and minimize costs. The black population in the United States has been a crucial source of cheap labor, while racism has fractionalized the working class in a way that has depressed overall wages. The basic point, Harris argues, is that black people are, and have always been, organically linked with American capitalism from its very beginning. It is clear from our discussion that Harris is deeply involved in various strains of Marxist scholarship. Nonetheless, it would be wrong to place him within the orthodoxy of Marxist tradition. In many of his published articles, Harris has problematized central features and predictions of Marxist thinking. Moreover, we did not review the large proportion of Harris's work, which is best described as post-Keynesian rather than Marxist, although there is a notable overlap between the two. What then can we say about Harris's intellectual position? Harris is an economist who has taken a consistent and serious stance against the mainstream perspectives of his profession, drawing on diverse traditions to shed light on radical messages. One of Harris's chief concerns is the question of how capitalism as a system functions, which necessarily involves studying the macro-level patterns of distribution and capital accumulation. For Harris, answering this question necessarily requires examining power dynamics between classes, exploitation, and the destructive tendencies of capitalist competition. We can therefore say that the right-wing insinuations are completely well-founded. Harris is indeed a radical economist, precisely because he has chosen to dedicate his intellectual contributions to the study of capitalism as it actually is, and not through abstract models that do away with class, race, uneven development, exploitation, and inequality.